Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little. I'm here today with the 174th episode of Weekly Poker Hand. We're down to 15 players in the $5,000 buy-in six-handed World Series of Poker event. We're almost making a deep run. Here I raised to 32,000 on the button at 8,000, 16,000 out of my 370,000 chip stack, which I think is fine. I could also see myself just open shoving this hand if the players are very good. That is a big shove, and I'm not going to say you want to shy away from risking your whole stack in tournaments necessarily, but I typically shy away from risking my tournament life unnecessarily. So anyway, I like the small raise. The main time you don't want to be raising small with this type of hand is when you expect to get re-raised very often or shoved on, because if you raise this and get shoved on, it's very close to a call. And again, you really don't want to be calling off with hands that are roughly flipping in equity. And if your opponents know that, they can just jam on you and make you fold way too often. So definitely be sure that if your opponents are aggressive, you structure your range so that you are raising and calling off appropriately. And I think a lot of people just raise the button with all sorts of garbage. They get jammed on and they don't know what to do. And they don't really understand that if they're raising with all sorts of garbage, they have to call the all-in from very aggressive players with all sorts of garbage. So anyway, I make it 32,000. Big blind, who I have labeled as splashy enough with a lot of chips, elects to call. Flop comes ace 5-2, giving me two pair, which is normally fantastic, but there's three clubs on the board. So we lose to any hand containing two clubs, and any hand with a club has 40% equity or so. So my opponent checks, and I definitely want to bet in this spot. And I decided to go 40,000 into the 90,000 pot. I think I would prefer a little bit of a bigger bet in this scenario, because even if my opponent's calling only to see the turn with a random club, he's getting almost the right price to call. And that's not really what you want to do. You want to price your opponent out by a decent amount so that if your opponent does have a hand like king of spades, jack of clubs, he folds. So I think I would prefer a bet of about 60,000 into the 90,000 pot. And if I get check raised, I'm just going with the hand. I do understand I'm going to be stone dead sometimes, and I certainly don't want to be stone dead too often, but it's just the risk you have to take whenever you have a hand like this. Because if your opponent's check raising with hands like any ace, because he just wants to get it all in while he thinks he's ahead, or if he's check raising the king of clubs, or maybe even a hand like six of clubs, four of diamonds that you decided to peel with preflop, well then folding a hand like this would be a disaster. And if I bet here and get raised, I think I just have to go with any ace 10 or better for sure, and then maybe even some of the weaker aces. So this hand's certainly good enough to go with. But I would have preferred a bigger bet on the flop to price my opponent out a bet. So I do bet 40, he calls. Turn is a jack of diamonds, and my opponent checks again, and now I have to decide if I'm going to go all in for 306,000 into the 170,000 pot, or if I'm going to bet small, like 70,000, or if I'm going to make a sort of weird size bet of 150,000, that would be about half of my stack. In this scenario, I very often either go all in or bet on the smaller side, and I think I would prefer a bet of about 90,000 out of my 306,000 stack. Again, just to try to not give my opponent great odds to call, while at the same time ensuring I get a lot of value from hands like an ace. I decided to go 70,000 in game. And again, I think I'd prefer just to fold, because if my opponent has a king or a queen or any club really, he's getting basically the right price to call. Of course, he's going to be a little bit less inclined to call now with something like 10-9 with the 10 of clubs, because there's no guarantee the 10 of clubs is good. It could just be drawing dead. So I'm okay with this bet size. I like this small bet on the turn better than I like the small bet on the flop. But again, we have to figure out what we're going to do if we get check raised. And you just have to call it off is what it amounts to. And if I had a hand like ace 10, if I got check raised, I think we still just have to call it off. You have to realize that now if your opponent does have a draw, he's really incentivized to check raise. Because if he check calls, and the river's a club, giving him a flush, if he leads, I'm probably not going to call unless I also have a good club, in which case I would have put money in anyway. And if he misses on the river, say the river's whatever, 9 at diamonds, and he leads, well, now I'm going to call with all of my made hands. So this is not a good spot to check call from out of position with a marginal draw. even if you are getting very near break-even odds, because you're going to have a tough time extracting any value later. So if you're going to play that hand, you should usually check raise if there's any realistic chance that the opponent, me in this scenario, is betting with more than just very good hands. So if Jay Card Shark here, me, would be betting with stuff like a weak ace with the intention of folding it if I get jammed, or if I would be betting a hand like pocket sevens with a 7 of clubs and folding it if I get jammed, well then check shoving with the king of clubs is great, right? Because now he's going to make me fold out all sorts of hands that he loses to, that he's going to have a tough time playing against on the river. However, when the opponent bets the flop and the turn in this scenario, I don't think you really want to be check raising that much, because Jay Card Shark here is usually going to have either a pretty strong made hand that's going to call a shove, or just some absolute garbage that has almost no equity, like maybe 7 of... Well, I'm trying to think of the offsuit hands I could have. I could have stuff like king of spades, 10 of clubs, or something like that has a little bit of equity, but really isn't loving the situation and can make some better stuff fold. Maybe even hands like... The problem is the board's so dry, right? Maybe I could have stuff like queen 10 of hearts. That'd be a pretty sweet bluff hand. Because with the queen 10 of hearts, I can bet, and if I get shoved on, I have a very, very easy fold, and I'm happy to fold, right? You don't necessarily want to bet hands that have a lot of equity, because if you bet a lot of equity and get jammed, well, now you're folding out a lot of equity. So anyway, I go 70,000 here, and if my opponent does shove, we're calling. If he calls, do we go for value on the river? Well, if the river's a blank, notice there actually aren't any blanks. One thing I think a lot of people don't realize is that on this exact board, ace, 5, 2, jack, like what are blanks on the river? Almost any card besides a 9, 8, 7, or 6, actually 9, 8, or 7, complete some sort of a straight and can make my opponent's obvious ace X hands have 2 pairs. So I'm actually going to check behind on a lot of rivers, I think, even though it may be leaving value on the table. Kind of like we talked about in the previous episode of Weekly Poker Hand. You want to minimize effectively flipping, and whenever you shove in this spot for value and you get called, I don't know if we have much of an edge at all. This time my opponent did fold and we win the pot. I actually wrote on my notes that maybe we should just check behind on the turn, but I don't like that play. I think that I certainly should bet the turn as I did, because we do want to protect our equity and we can get shoved on by worse hands. So I like this. And this is certainly how I'd play the hand today, although I probably would have used slightly larger bet sizes. That's going to be it for this episode of Weekly Poker Hand. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review, like it on YouTube, leave a positive review on iTunes. That would be very beneficial for me. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck in your games, and I will talk to you next week.